Hello and welcome to Norfolk Constructing Excellence in the East of England. My name is Warren Salmons. I work for Morgan Sindall Construction and I'm also the chair of Norfolk Constructing Excellence. And it's my pleasure today to welcome Ed Gillespie to join us. He will be presenting a talk on sustainability and the future. He's a well-known podcaster and consultant. And today's event is kindly sponsored by Redhead Architects, who are just celebrating their first year in business. So congratulations to John Norcliffe and his team. Um, we have the benefit of me re-recording this introduction because we did have technical difficulties at the beginning of the event on the 15th of December. So I'll hand you straight over and we'll pick up from where Ed started his presentation. I hope you enjoy.
In the meantime, it is a pleasure to join you this Tuesday lunchtime. I thought we were starting at 2, so I've just had a slightly scrabbled arrangement to get myself online and ready, but I'm all prepared. This is actually my hat trick. I think this is the 3rd year on the trot I've joined you for your festive provocation, although sadly, obviously, we will not be doing that in person and followed by convivial drinks and a meal afterwards. Although John promises me there's a hamper in the post, which I can then sit and enjoy by myself. So let's hope we can bring, here we go. This is where we need to be. So I will crack straight into this. So I've titled this talk Beyond Building Back Better, trying to reimagine construction. It's going to be quite a broad talk though, and hopefully we can draw some of the relevant conclusions from it, from your specific areas of interest. But clearly we are not in a position where we can avoid the virus. We've just gone into tier 3 lockdown in London, or going into tier 3 lockdown tomorrow, which means everyone is probably on Oxford Street fiercely shopping like their lives depended on it, and strangely they might. But clearly this has been a very odd year. When I gave the talk last year, if you'd been offering free hugs to people, you'd have been deemed an empathetic human being. Free hugs now makes you look like an absolutely unhinged sociopath. And I've been describing this in my talks this year as the apocalypse. 2020 used to be the way we talked about perfect vision. And actually 2020 has revealed something rather different. But this is the original meaning of the word apocalypse, the drawing back of the veil. The uncovering, the revealing, the exposure of the pipework underneath to show us how things are actually working and how uncomfortable that might actually be. Lots of people want to see the pandemic as some kind of unfortunate accident, a bit like Brexit. But as our own astronomer royal Martin Rees said back in 2015, he said, actually, our interconnected and interdependent world means that our social frameworks would be absolutely vulnerable to breakdown as soon as the fatality rate is a fraction of 1%. That's when our healthcare systems become overwhelmed. And as we have seen, that is very clearly demonstrated by what's happened. Also, some people did see it coming. The All England Lawn Tennis Club, who host Wimbledon, had quite happily been paying a £1 million a year pandemic insurance, and which happily paid out £100 million at the cancellation of this year's tournament. So some were prepared. And at the same time, as you'll know from the theme of my previous 2 talks, climate change hasn't gone away. This is the image from fire season in San Francisco. This is obviously the Golden Gate Bridge, merged there in this sort of apocalyptic end of days type fiery smog coming from all the fires surrounding the city. So I gave a workshop in the Bank of England in January this year on what we might call non-linear risks. And I put it to that workshop that there were 3 key comfortable myths we are telling ourselves. 1, we know what's going on and what's likely to happen in the next 5 to 15 years. Secondly, that we have a sense of control and that whatever happens, we'll find a way to tame it. And thirdly, we understand the leadership that will be required, and we are confident that our decision-making institutions are up to it. Now, I would say off the back of the Australian fires, which had immediately preceded that workshop at the end of 2019 and the turn of the year, in which Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison had previously stood up in Parliament and said, this is coal, don't be afraid, don't be scared, as if burning coal was a huge asset and attribute to the Australian economy before an area the size of Austria burnt down. And what we saw with that loss of probably 1 billion animals, literally hundreds of square miles of land, thousands of homes, hundreds of people displaced, dozens of deaths, was a new phenomenon which we call pyrocumulonimbus, which is actually fires so intense they generate their own weather systems, which then seed new fires through lightning bursts. And we'd only previously seen that through volcanic eruptions, where you get these highly charged particle clouds emerging from the crater, which then generate electricity and lightning strikes. This is actually the Mount Taal volcano in the Philippines, not a CGI image. This is a real thing. So you can perhaps see where the myths of dragons might have come from. But the point I'm making is, you know, this is unprecedented stuff. And what we were saying in that workshop at the Bank of England is what we're facing is the combination of simple, linear and predictable trends combining through tipping points to create complex, non-linear, exponential and chaotic outcomes. And in the example of the Australian fires, that is simple, linear, predictable trends of rising temperatures, increased drought, increased wind and austerity cuts to fire and forestry services, combining to create rapidly spreading multiple converging megafires that are quite literally out of control. And as climate scientist Michael Mann said, this is not in the models. So we're dealing with some fairly unprecedented challenges. And the three things that we talked about at that Bank of England workshop were what we might call highly unlikely but very high impact events, those low probability, devastating impact events. One of which was extreme climate change, using the Australian fires as a case in point. The other two were pandemics and academic crises. Now, little did we know in January that we were about to have all three happening at the same time. So I would say to you that we actually have three key uncomfortable truths to confront. One is that we're facing some quite significant unknown unknowns. And I think even with a vaccine, we'll see the kind of the challenge of the coronavirus rolling well into 2021 and perhaps beyond. Secondly, the fact that we're very much not in control, and perhaps it's arrogant and hubristic to even think so. And thirdly, that leadership is just part of the mix for responsible organising. And you saw that in the Australian fires in terms of the grassroots organisations helping to support local residents and firefighters, and obviously the mutual aid networks which sprang up across the world in response to COVID-19 are not necessarily a top-down approach. They're very much bottom-up. And we're very familiar with the flattening of the COVID-19 curve, you know, to bring using protective measures to bring the number of cases within the healthcare system capacity. But let's also be honest that this is an artifact of what we might call zoonosis, the jumping of these species across these viruses across species barriers. And on average, a new infectious disease emerges in humans every 4 months, coming from our encroachment into that wild ecological space. And the list is a long one: HIV, Ebola, bird flu, swine flu, MERS, SARS, West Nile, Zika. All of these are what we might call examples of zoonosis. And COVID-19 is just the latest in that particular trajectory. And as the United Nations Environment Programme Executive Director Inga Anderson has said, we are intimately connected with nature, whether we like it or not. If we don't take care of nature, we can't take care of ourselves. And if we needed a sharper lesson than what has happened with COVID-19, then I'm struggling to find it, because I think this is basically the huge warning shot across the bows, which clarifies so many of the issues that I've been working on for 20 years. Because as Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, said, you can't self-isolate from climate change. So what we're trying to do with the climate measures is to bring global temperatures down within that Paris Agreement threshold of 1.5 to 2 degrees with climate protective measures. So it's very similar to flattening the curve. And I put it to you that what if climate change was the physical reality that we faced and it was capitalism that was made up? Because we have seen this again through the pandemic, in the fact that, yes, we have to try and save the economy and bring some elements of the economy together, but you can't negotiate with the virus and you can't negotiate with climate change, as we are seeing. And even if we might wish this away, that is not going to be possible. And you can think of this as 4 successive waves, if you like. So the COVID-19 wave has already broken. Coming on behind that is the economic recession wave. The UK has lost something like 20% of GDP over the last 9-10 months. Coming behind that, we have the climate change wave. And then perhaps if you really are in for a treat, we get biodiversity collapse and some of that ecosystem threat. And we also need to be honest that the recovery is not going to be V-shaped. It's probably not even going to be U-shaped. It's probably going to be L-shaped. It's going to be what we call a kind of propagation of the low-touch economy. And I think we're still only seeing the early stages of the types of consolidation of new patterns of behaviour, which have partly come about as a result of the pandemic, but are also going to create other forms of economic disruption, particularly, I think, in terms of the built environment, property and construction sectors. Because the most fundamental thing I will say here is the fact that I do not think the commute is going to return in the same way that we had it before. It will come back in some way, shape or form. We will have a percentage of people travelling, perhaps a percentage of the time. But the cumulative madness that built up over decades and led to all sorts of incredible costs on the economy in terms of time, stress, illness, you name it, that commuting is not going to return. And so we're going to have this huge opportunity to rethink the way our urban environments work. And most experts are still agreeing that this recovery is going to be long and slow and bumpy, even after the vaccine, which is going to be a slow rollout. It's going to be a progressive one, and it will also probably not provide 100% protection. We also have that nagging risk of evolving variants of the virus, as it seems like we have in the southeast at the moment, which whilst the current vaccine may work on it, that may not be the case in future years. And it hasn't all been bad. I mean, lockdown has been a very weird experience for us all, I'm sure, but we know about the kind of the iconic images which have come in from around the world, whether it's the kind of the canals of Venice clearing, allowing us to see the fish swimming along beneath the surface because there was no motor traffic to stir up the sediments. Equally, there are so many cities where the removal of so many vehicles from the streets and the shutting down of industry led to the rediscovery of blue skies and vistas and views and the ability to see more than a few hundred yards through the urban smog. And we should also note that actually that is still a devastating health impact globally. If you want to sit that alongside the pandemic impacts, air pollution still kills 1 in 8 people around the world. So actually sustaining the old paradigm and doing less bad is no longer good enough. You know, actually this return to normal, whatever you want to define that as, or to build back better, ain't going to cut it. We have to do much, much more. Plus, we know there are also all sorts of social inequalities and discontinuities involved as well. The kind of the agglomeration of what you might call amoral wealth in a very, very small number of people has only got worse. But the other thing that the pandemic has done is driven a massive wedge into our concepts of inequality. Most of us on this call, I imagine, are successful professionals who, whilst we might have flipped onto Zoom calls and stayed at home, have still managed to make a living and get by and perhaps even enjoy relative comfort in our gardens over the spring and summer. That is not the case for what you might call the precariat, who have been stuck with whole families in small flats and perhaps with no work at all, relying on furlough or, if worse, nothing at all. And so management guru Charles Handy has said we're entering an age of unreason, a time when the future in so many areas is to be shaped by us and for us. And the only prediction that holds true is that this is a time for bold imagining. And we have to think the unlikely and do the unreasonable. It's one of the things I do on one of the podcasts I co-host, John Richardson and the Futurenauts, with British comedian John Richardson, where myself and reluctant futurist Mark Stevenson discuss how we address these systemic challenges we face. Now in its second series, do tune in if that's your thing. But what we try and do at the Futurenauts is stretch the imagination of the possible, not predict the trends of where we might go. And one of the things which really made me sit up last week was, this is Dan Jorgensen, Danish climate minister, who basically announced that there'll be no new oil and gas exploration from Denmark in the North Sea. They will honour existing licenses, but there will be no new exploration. Now that's huge because Denmark is the biggest exporter of oil and gas in the EU. Obviously Norway being just on the other side of the EU border. And he said, I think there's an English expression, put your money where your mouth is, and that is basically what we are trying to do. So there's some big stuff going on, and it needs to be big. I showed this slide a couple of years ago, I think, in terms of the Great Acceleration. I've just revisited it now because we're still in this exponential phase where the exponential impacts are growing, and we are not even necessarily slowing the pace of change in the wrong direction, let alone getting us going in the right direction. And if you poll all the experts here, we see all of the experts pretty much in broad agreement that whatever sustainability challenge you look at, the urgency of that and the severity of it is rising after the pandemic. The Global World Economic Forum looks at its long-term risk outlook, and you can see nearly all of the green dots there. Over half of the multi-stakeholder risks are environment related. And at the same time, we've seen lots of activity from industry saying the race to net zero. We're going to actually be net zero. Now, this is welcome, but it's going to create an absolute car crash because people are not transforming their businesses to a net zero organization. They're probably doing some incremental efficiencies and then attempting to offset and mitigate the rest. Now, that ain't going to be good enough, and there's rapidly going to be huge demand for what we might call high quality offsets. The good news is the destination is agreed, but the debate is how fast we get there. Some people doing crazy things like Microsoft are actually saying they're going to remove all the carbon the company's ever emitted since it was founded in 1975. But as I say, still we are stuck in a linear economy type of mindset. We're still doing throughput of take, make, use and dispose. We're not going to get ourselves into the right position if we sustain that type of mentality. And I've made this point previously, but actually sustainability is a mere stepping stone towards what must become very rapidly and perhaps in an uncomfortably fast way, a regenerative economy actually pushing through. And there are hopes of recovery coming through here. Walmart, one of the world's biggest businesses, being one of the biggest companies in the United States, has committed to becoming a restorative business. They're going zero emissions, but not only that, they're actually looking at sustainably managing 50 million acres of land and 1 million square miles of ocean. Now that's big, and they're going to be doing that obviously through renewables, electrification, a big opportunity in terms of their refrigeration, but also changing the agricultural and fishing practices that they have on their supply chain land where they source their products from. So that's big, and putting nature at the heart of a possible solution. And I think that's where sustainability has to mature into. It goes away from this sort of machine-like approach to the world where we might be consulting with stakeholders and doing a little bit less harm, through the kind of community net positive impact, which is very much about balancing the books, to a genuinely planetary-based regenerative living system. And I think that's where it gets exciting, because the thought I'd like to leave you with over Christmas is that regenerative business is the only future. We have to have businesses which are not able only to limit their impact, but to actually enhance the positivity and to restore the world around them. Now, you'll have heard me mention purpose before, because I think purpose is a key driver, but we've got so much purpose wash out there now, masquerading as an authentic purpose, but it's essentially just covering the fact that delivering fiduciary responsibility to shareholders is still the primary concern. Now, I said before that companies that don't live their sense of purpose will be disrupted by others. And the example I've used is Tyson Foods, the big meat producer and distributor who bought into the plant-based burger company, with the CEO saying, I don't want to have a Kodak moment. But the dilemma we face is that we have to do this in alignment. There's no such thing as a sustainable company in an unsustainable world. And so our purpose has to get planetary pretty quick, because all of these things are interconnected. Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, has said, without a sense of purpose, no company, either public or private, can achieve its full potential. And I would argue that planetarily, we can't achieve our full potential either without us aligning towards that. And Laura Storm, who wrote the book on regenerative leadership, saying designing a way of living and leading flourishing lives based on principles conducive to life is the key mission of our times. If you're not working on this, then what are you doing? Because we've had a pretty unequivocal message coming towards us. And I think that taps directly into what we might call an economy of meaning, because purpose is not just about organizational purpose. It's about having purpose and responsibility and meaning in our jobs. About 83% of employees are either disengaged or actively disengaged from their work, which is what the late great anthropologist David Graeber would call bullshit jobs. where he says we've become a civilization based on work, and not even productive work, but work as an end and a meaning in itself. And it's a great book. And what David has identified is at least 5 categories of total bullshit jobs. So there's the flunkies who just make their superiors feel important, the goons, the lobbyists, the corporate lawyers, the PR specialists, the duct tapers who temporarily fix problems that should be fixed permanently, the box tickers and the taskmasters. We need to be finding, this is where perhaps the pandemic has missed a huge opportunity, because rather than furlough everyone, this would have been a great chance to actually fundamentally look at what universal basic income could look like and to liberate so many of us from pointless bullshit jobs without meaning. The next thing I think we need to think, so as well as planetary purpose and an economy of meaning, the third thing we should be thinking about is genuine intergenerational equity. Now, that's been a buzzword in sustainability for some time, but for those of you who have kids, it brings it into obviously sharper focus. But perhaps we should be thinking about this in terms of 7th-generation thinking, where not just in that Native American or American Indian way of looking at the world 7 generations hence, but putting ourselves in that hinge generation between perhaps our great-grandparents and our great-grandchildren, the generations that we might, if we are lucky, have been able to meet during our lifetime, and the ones that might actually arrive before we depart. So it reflects the wide time span of influence and influences that one life can touch. And what can we learn that is brilliant from our great-grandparents that will also help secure the world for our great-grandchildren? And bearing in mind, when you look at the Great Acceleration, our great-grandparents were living in that world way before that Great Acceleration kicked off. And to put that into context, one of the best books I read this year was by Tyson Yunkaporta called Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Change the World. And this guy is an Australian Aboriginal. And he says we're at the start of a 1,000-year undertaking, because that is how long it will take for the old growth forests to return. And that's a sobering way to take it, because if you look at it, that it's going to take us a millennium to replace what we have cut down into the last 200 years. And that's powerful, that's important. And so we have to get over this mindset of battling nature. It's not to be conquered or opposed. We need to learn how nature itself makes design decisions. And that's where the systemic thinking comes in. So, you know, we've looked at planetary purpose and economy of meaning, intergenerational equity, and now we have the systemic thinking. And I always go back to Kate Raworth, the renegade economist, where she talks about the donut for humanity, the safe and just donut built on a strong social foundation, but operating within a sustainable ecological ceiling. And you can see already on issues like climate change and biodiversity loss and land conversion, strictly relevant for this conversation, all of those are currently in overshoot at the moment. And we also need to look at this in terms of health. I mean, it's fascinating because a pandemic, as I said, the apocalypse has created these revelations, which meant we've looked at the world in a different way. But actually, there's very little correlation between healthcare spending and health outcomes. Interestingly, you know, the country which has the best health outcomes in the world, Spain, actually spends less per capita in terms of health spending per person than the UK, which is interesting, which is all to do with preventative measures, lifestyle, and other issues. The US has the most expensive per capita healthcare system in the world, and we've seen exactly how that has fared during the pandemic. This quote I like, which is, the US healthcare system is not broken. It's working exactly the way it was designed. It was just never designed to benefit patients. And so you have this weird world in which you have the right to bear arms, but treatment from gunshot wounds is a privilege. Now, I say this because I think it has a bit of a relevance, because when you have a government which announces 40 new hospitals, we should be absolutely clear that more hospitals, which we might like to design and build, and like to design and build very sustainably, does not equal better health outcomes. In the same way that more prisons does not equal safer communities. And the health outcomes, as we saw before, the number of hospital beds per 1,000 people does not influence the best health outcomes. For example, Spain comes in at 29th with less than 3 hospital beds per 1,000 people, but much, much better health outcomes. And I touch on that because the next thing is about being more collaborative rather than competitive. We have got to work together on this. And I think we've seen some interesting examples during the pandemic. The Rochdale pioneers trailblazed this in the mid-19th century, saying the cooperative ideal is as old as human society. It's the idea of conflict and competition as a principle of economic progress that is new. And we've then adopted and made that the mainstream element of our progress. And actually, it's often misrepresented in terms of the sort of Darwinian nature red in tooth and claw type of approach. And it's not. Actually, nature is far more cooperative and collaborative than it is competitive. And we need to think radically about what other cooperatives might emerge now. Top 300 co-ops in the world already turn over $1.6 trillion, have 100 million employees, and across every single sector that we care to name. Plus, we have the benefit corporations who start to address that notion of purpose as being beyond simple economic, fiduciary and shareholder duty. A benefit corporation will allow you to rewrite your articles of association to make social and environmental outcome as your primary reason for existence. And that's where the shakedown is coming. Increasingly, there are only two types of company, as Seth Godin, the American marketing guru, says, brave and dead. There are those companies which totally understand the new world which is struggling to be born and already exists in little pockets and enclaves around the planet. Or there are those who are conducting a kind of defensive rearguard action and actively slowing and decelerating that change. Because the other thing that the pandemic has done is it's taken existing trends and just magnified them. So when we come to thinking about building back better, we need to think about it radically. Now, one of the other podcasts I do is called The Great Humbling with my colleague Dougal Hine. And this is about taking a position of grounded humility. So getting beyond the arrogance and hubris of us trying to shape the world, but actually understanding what it might look like if we actually came at it from a truly grounded perspective. And as I've said before, if we're just going to build back better on the previous model, this is a bit like Darth Vader saying the construction of our new Death Star is an amazing job creation opportunity. Unfortunately, it destroys planets. And we know that the greenest brick is the one that's already in the wall. I have to say it every year because we still have to get our heads around the fact that the biggest challenge we have is still going to be, what does restorative retrofit look like? How are we going to make our existing building stock fit for purpose very, very quickly indeed? Because that's the ultimate challenge. We can build the most sexy, fancy, sustainable, low impact, zero carbon, passive house standard buildings all over the place, but we've got to do something with what's come beforehand. And again, I've said this before, but I think it's worth reiterating, is that we are still putting the money in the wrong place. And even throughout the pandemic, where, as I said, the commute has been upended, and perhaps we have an intervention which has created a moment of clarity in terms of our hypermobility and how much of our travel was actually fundamentally pointless, we are still pumping far too much infrastructure investment into roads and rail. And it's completely mad. We should be putting that into our building stock. You know, HS2 is still rumbling on with £100 billion plus price tag. It's going to have a huge amount of embodied carbon. We are destroying 120 irreplaceable ancient woodlands. I don't care what people say about so-called biodiversity offsets. As Tyson Yuncker pointed out, you can't biodiversity offset an ancient woodland. It takes hundreds of years to replace. There is no such thing as a like-for-like replacement. So for me, especially in the context of the pandemic, this really is scream if you really want to go faster, because we are not going to be hopefully moving in the way that we were before. And you ask the public what they want, and this is where I think there's a huge populist opportunity going begging, it's still cozy homes. When you ask what the government's number one big infrastructure spending priority should be, particularly if we're spending more of our time in them, which we clearly are, and also those cold homes kill more people than alcohol, road accidents or drug abuse. So for me, it's just a win-win-win. And we know, we had that lovely little film at the beginning. Places like Goldsmith Street are demonstrating what new build could look like in terms of radical sustainability and beauty, but they haven't necessarily done it retrospectively. Now, we've also seen, and I've been flagging this for the last couple of years, so I'm not taking credit, but hopefully my stretching of the imagination of the possible will touch a nerve here, because I talked about giant wind turbines. The government is now looking for the possibility of actually running almost 100% of our domestic electricity in the next 20 years from offshore wind. This has been a huge success story. 7 of the 10 biggest offshore wind farms are in the UK. It's something we should be rightly proud of in terms of powering the next revolution. But equally, that electrification can't just lead to, again, to a like-for-like replacement of existing fossil fuel combustion engine cars with electric cars, because we'll still be sat in clean, quiet traffic jams. It may be wonderful to reclaim a lot of that road space, which again would be an amazing opportunity for the rejuvenation and restoration of our cities in a regenerative style to actually get that road space back. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is certainly in the use of physical distancing pavement redesigns is one of the biggest takebacks of road space from the car for bicycles and pedestrians. Paris has been leading the way on this in the 15-minute city. And I think this, again, it is a huge opportunity for rethinking our urban environments. The City of London has also just committed to net zero by 2040, still too far away. I really would want to see these all by 2030. 2040 is still the long grass as many of these things are concerned. And I think collectively, and there's 70 people on this call, we're not stuck in traffic, we are traffic. We all have to be acting in a more coordinated and complementary way together, because the biggest thing that is going to shift the needle on so many of these impacts and create the new opportunities is change of lifestyle. The percentage of our footprint and the potential of our impact is infrastructural. We've got to change our behaviours. We've got to get on our bikes. We've got to be cycling. Actually, one of the reasons that the UK has been so vulnerable to COVID-19 is not just the ineptitude of our political leadership, but it's also the fact that we're fat and unfit. There are all sorts of lifestyle issues which have made us more vulnerable to a respiratory illness like COVID-19. And even before the pandemic, the way that people travelled into central London was changing. The number of cyclists had already overtaken the car. I just think we have to design the car out. It's not just about balancing need, it's actually about leading change. And when you look at the work of Project Drawdown from US environmentalist Paul Hawken, who looked at the 100 key ways of bringing down carbon emissions, you'll see that actually a lot of these are lifestyle or behavior related. So number one, interestingly, is refrigeration. Again, that has a COVID-19 connection because the virus vaccine, which is being rolled out at the moment, requires refrigeration down to minus 70 degrees. So the cold chain is absolutely critical, and the global cold chain is a vast consumer of energy. Then, of course, you have wind turbines, but then you look at number 3, which is reduction of food waste. Number 4, which is non-meat-based diets, or at least plant-rich diets, which are also connected into the maintenance and conservation of tropical forests. And then 5 and 6, we have educating girls and family planning, the liberation and empowerment of women. So many of these are social. They have to change because we're still wasting somewhere between 30 to 50% of the food we produce. It never reaches a human stomach. Although, again, hearteningly, the pandemic has meant that we throw less stuff away because we've been using the things we bring into our homes much more efficiently. We also have to cut, though, the carbon emissions which come from livestock agriculture. With, as we know, livestock agriculture are responsible for a greater percentage of carbon emissions, 18% globally, than all transport combined, 15% globally. And that type of stuff hasn't changed during the pandemic. We might have moved less, but we haven't stopped eating less moos. And I've said this previously, but actually it's about the fact that we've turned the planet into an enormous larder in order to provide for our voracious needs. Of course, there's also the kind of the brilliant innovations of the vegan sausage roll, as pioneered by Greggs, which Piers Morgan famously said literally no one was wanting, at which point it promptly sold out. And then if you prefer it, the kind of sort of powdered alternatives of things like Soylent and Huel, which I like to describe as the artificial insemination of food. It does the job, but with none of the pleasure. And so to conclude, or to wind things up in this roller coaster, we're still at that point, I think, where we're on the brink of breakdown. We're on the precipice, you know, and change as usual, that third way is not going to get us through. We actually have to break through. We actually have to take the courageous steps forward in perhaps bold ways that we've never done before. Joanna Macy, the American Buddhist environmentalist, calls this the Great Turning. And she said it's a dark time filled with suffering and uncertainty because, like larger cells or like living cells in a larger body, we're feeling the trauma of the world. So we shouldn't be afraid to express that, to talk about our discomfort and our unhappiness or our frustration with the pace of change. I think we need to be more radically honest with each other about what we're experiencing here, because it's the denial, or if you like, the corporatization of these debates, which is going to slow the pace of change. So let's be frank and talk about what is moving in our hearts, because the culture is going to influence how we strategically respond. And our culture, where we're still blaming the virus as a sort of unfortunate occurrence, where climate change is merely a kind of problem associated with too much carbon emissions, rather than a way that we are living in the world and the relationships we have with it and ourselves, then we have to shift that culture. Because right now our culture is still like a kid with a machine gun. We are doing an extremely good and effective job of waging a war on the natural world and waging metaphorical and both literal wars on each other. So we need to move beyond that. The planet doesn't want to be saved. I get absolutely infuriated with everyone saying, want to save the planet. It doesn't want to be rescued or even changed. A planet wants to be loved. You know, that's the appreciation. That's the gratitude. That's what you see when you experience and walk through a mature old growth forest, where you see that peak climax community of interconnection, which has co-evolved and co-developed together. And no amount of beautiful horticultural planting will ever replace that. And so it is about gratitude and appreciation. And it is, as I said, about embracing a different way of engaging with these challenges. It's not just about the logical, rational head. It's about the heart and the compassion and the kindness. And it's about the intuition of the gut. And I think art is going to be critical. Peter Sellers, the theatre director, said, artists should be at the centre of society, keeping alive that utopian vision. And we're all about visions, because society will not improve if the people envisioning a better society are politicians. One of my favourite examples in the built environment stuff was this guy, James Mackay, who's an environmentalist who draws the future and helps people actually imagine what our urban scapes of tomorrow might look like, with all the things that we'd expect, these revitalized local markets and trading, the change of the high street to beyond shopping, the electric vehicles, you name it. These are very powerful urban farms and just ideas that we know would actually create and actually perhaps revive the city centres, where they're not constantly driven by retail rents and incomes. Because if we learned one thing over the last 9 months, is that only the impossible is interesting. We've had these latent, if you like, simple, linear, predictable trends accelerated by the impact of the pandemic into exponential, out of control trends, which have forced us to adapt in ways that we had never considered possible before and never considered credible. And we've done it. And I often go back to Ivan Illich, who famously wrote about conviviality. And he said, societies in which most people depend for most of their goods and services on the personal whim, kindness or skill of another are called underdeveloped, while those in which living has been transformed into a process of ordering from an all-encompassing store catalogue, and he wrote this 30 years before the internet, are called advanced. And I think we need to flip that notion on its head. So we're going to have to reimagine the high street beyond shopping. We're going to have to genuinely bring residential and properly mixed use and different types of engagement spaces and services where that conviviality could come back into the hearts of where we live. And we're also going to have to change the ownership. I'm very proud to announce that I've been involved, those of you who are fans of the Locks in Geldeston, very proud to announce that we are about to launch a community share issue, because we successfully bought the pub in a preemptive bid before auction at the end of last year. And it's about returning these supposedly dead businesses, which can't necessarily be run for some rapacious corporate profit, but can be run beautifully and functionally and rewardingly and happily for, by and with the community. And whilst we're here on right on the edge of the brink of potentially a no deal breakfast, This could be about taking back control, not in some bullshit notion of sovereignty, but actually in terms of taking back control of local food, taking back control of local energy, taking back control of local high streets, taking back control of local pubs. That's the kind of ethos that could be the real opportunity, and trust me, I'm not a Brexiteer by any stretch of the imagination. But if we could put some real substance and sustenance behind that, then I think we'd be getting somewhere. Because as the head of Trade and Export Council in New Zealand said, the world is hunting for health. It's hunting for countries that care for their people and care for their environment. That's where we need to be headed. Because when people say, oh my God, it's all too late, I get very frustrated with the polarity between projected hope and projected hopelessness. On the one side, you have people who are kind of banging the drum of false techno-utopian optimism, that somehow technology will provide all the answers, that we can fix all of these things, and we can't fix something like climate change. We have to work our way through it. Those are the revolutionaries and messiahs, and it's problematic. Equally, the hopelessness that takes us down the fatalistic, hedonistic or nihilistic route of people hating misanthropy. And in the middle, where I try and sit with the Futurenauts and the great humbling and the work I do, is that how do we use the humor and the humility and the hyper self-reflectivity to keep asking ourselves the difficult questions, which don't allow us to sink into the false optimism or the hopeless fatalism, which are the projected positions we can find ourselves in. But how can we stay laughing, stay grounded, and stay asking the difficult, uncomfortable questions? Because ultimately, there's a serendipity embedded in all of this, that actually the things that are good for the planet are also good for us. Whether it's exercise, whether it's diet, whether it's mobility, whether it's enjoyment, connection, and exposure to nature. All of those things are good for us and are good for the world. And so we need to rediscover that beautiful serendipity. And I will finish with this line, which came from the civil rights in the 1960s. And has been adopted by Amnesty International. I think it's extremely relevant in the context of climate change, and of course, obviously, in the sense of the COVID-19 pandemic. None of us are safe until all of us are safe. We have an opportunity to start to rebuild a genuinely regenerative economy, which can restore nature, bring us back to health through better diets, clean energy, and create a more beautiful world around us. And that is what we should be mulling on and reflecting on perhaps over the festive season. Thank you very much.
Ed, again, that was brilliant, as always. And I think I've just seen a Christmas present for a few members of my family there on your last slide.
Oh, yeah. I've also got a book of poetry out if anyone...
Indeed you have.
If anyone wants to, it's my cheaper plug. Songs of Love in Lockdown. I'll put a link in the chat.
Brilliant, please do. And we'll get some links from you. We'll put them on our website as well, so people can follow you on Twitter, get access to your podcast and stuff like that. Thanks very much, Ed. Really thought-provoking stuff there. I did reflect halfway through there that I'm somewhere between a flunky and a goon, which is, but it does pay the mortgage at the moment, so I have to continue with that. I'm just wondering if there's any questions from anybody.
Verified them all again.
I think you have. Stunned silence, as always.
This is the problem when people haven't got their cameras on, you see.
Yeah.
Can't tell. Everyone's like,
feel free. I think Saul Humphrey's just got his camera on there. He normally has.
Hi, Warren. Hi, Ed.
Hi.
I joined a touch late. I apologise for that. And I was just on the slide when you were sharing Kate Raworth's donor economics model. I also heard a podcast you did very recently, Ed, which was excellent. In that podcast, she was observing our fixation with GDP and the metric of growth, and that it has to stop. Do you see any sign of that coming?
I don't see it coming from our political leaders, because they still use GDP as such a kind of convenient shorthand. I think we do. I mean, that needs to be something that's challenged at all levels when we talk about, flourishing and thriving beyond pure economic success. Because I don't know if you hear for this bit, Saul, but I said, we've lost 20% of GDP during the course of the pandemic. Now that has hit people in a very uneven and unequal fashion. And I think we really do need a genuine shift towards an economy of well-being, which is where obviously the donut that Kate talks about begins to take us. It's like so many of the things that we realize that we really value over the course of the last 9 or 10 months are, you know, the ability to connect with fellow human beings in a way which isn't orientated around physical distancing. It is the ability to get access to and enjoy wild green space and nature, you know, and beyond those two things, then there's some other stuff, but those are the two most important bits. How do we get out, and how do we get out to see the people we love? And I think that's where this idea that the best things in life are actually carbon neutral could be really powerful, because you can see then that if we orientated more of our activities towards the delivery of those outcomes, and not just about the sort of commercialization about, or how do we rinse this for profit? And that's why the pub is such a good example, because pubs don't make enough money as, you know, viable financial concerns for the big pub operating companies, because they're worth more as property. So they get flogged off, even though they might be priceless community assets. You know, and you should listen to our Future Noughts episode on the future of pubs, because we'll get into this in great detail. But if we change the parameters and say, actually, this is about the community benefit, and if we can raise the finance to buy a pub, then we can run it, you know, totally effectively, so it could wash its face, and then we keep that there. But that would never work on a spreadsheet when we start to tot up the numbers. And I don't think it's coming from the top. I think it's coming, this type of thinking is coming from below.
Thank you, Ed. That's great. And incidentally, your pub is not far from me. I'm near Beccles.
Well, there we go.
Your greatest risk, I think, your pub has is from, ironically, flooding.
Flooding. I know. We know that. I call it the pub of the long now, but it's only got a metre elevation above sea level. So I reckon we got 50 years.
Good luck. Enjoy them. Thanks, Warren.
Thanks, Saul. Any other questions from anybody else? Please do feel free to turn your camera on, unmute, and make a comment. I think, as before, Ed, people are often a little bit in awe, shocked, trying to digest everything that you've just said. And
it's
just
Tuesday lunchtime.
And it's Tuesday lunchtime. They've probably just ate some vegan sausage rolls as well.
I take myself by surprise, you see, sometimes. I don't quite know what I'm going to say.
For everybody who is listening, I'll imagine, like many, you will want to share this with your colleagues who have not been able to make it on the call. It is being recorded. It will be on the website later on this week, and we should have that live for you soon. Okay, so
that's great. Have a wonderful Christmas, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thanks for your time, Ed. And I do urge everybody to listen to the podcasts. They are hugely entertaining.
Thank you.
So everybody, I think Ed has now left. I think he's looking after his childcare responsibilities. And hopefully my screens are now sharing with you, and you can see my presentation. I'm trying to just quickly flick through. Again, it's not working again. We'll do it the old-fashioned way. So thanks again to Ed today, and many thanks to Redhead Architects who have sponsored the event. Again, without our sponsors, there's no way we can put these things on. We need to pay for the Zoom license and upkeep of our website and things like that. So many thanks to John Norcliffe and everybody at Redhead. Coming up soon, so next year, 2021, on 12th of January, we have a session on MMC with a gentleman called Daniel Everett, and he is a director of N-House. They're based over in Peterborough, and he'll be talking about their product, which is a modular house and passive house, and he'll be talking to us about the story of that business and how they come about. And interestingly, referring to Ed's thoughts on bottom-up approach, I do believe that company was seed funded from crowdfunding of the local community. So should be a very interesting presentation next month, and we will look to try and get a couple of other panelists to join in the debate at the end of that talk. And we are nearly there. It's the end of the year, everybody. It's December, but it doesn't mean we just look forward. We are going to look back. Unfortunately, we didn't have the awards this year. And next year we will be covering our awards for a 2-year period. So any projects completed worked on in 2019 and 2020 will be valid as award entrants. You can find all the details on our website, norfolkconstructingexcellence.com, and the application forms are there as well. So that leaves me just to say thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for bearing with us with the difficult technical issues that I've had today. Who'd have thought something about the future and I can't get the current technology working, but hopefully next year it'll be a bit better. And I'd just like to wish you all a very, very Merry Christmas, and we'll see you all in January. Thank you very much.